and thanks for inviting me here today. I'm super excited to be here, not least because one of my former colleagues, Daryl, is on the phone, and I don't think I've seen him for, 7 or 8 years. And amazingly, he hasn't aged a day despite COVID.
Thank you, Carolina. It's so good to see you as well.
um, so my goal today is to talk a little bit about this whole question of capital. How do we get access to capital and how do we deploy it for the communities and the issues that we care about? But I also wanted to just sort of situate the emergence of a community development field in its history. Because I think to Dylan's point and to Bobby's point, right, we have seen capital deployed in really harmful ways to the detriment of communities of color, low-income communities, and sometimes it has even like had the moniker of community development. And so why should we trust this thing, right? Why should we do community development? So I want to talk a little bit about where the origins of the community development movement come from and how we think about that today, and then sort of how we think about capital in really trying to do what all of you are hoping to do, which is make your communities better places for the people who live there, right? And ultimately it is about the people who live there and not these investments we're making. I have some slides. I'm a professor. I like talking to my slides, but it is much less important to me to get through my slides than it is to make sure I'm answering the questions you have. So feel free at any point to interrupt me with questions, reflections, thoughts. Let's not just make this be me talking at you, and really welcome your feedback and questions as we go. Let me just start by saying that when I think about urban spaces, when I think about cities, and when I think about the communities in our cities that are poor, neglected, don't have the resources, that are structurally vulnerable to processes like COVID, right? I think about 3 dimensions for what shapes cities the way they are. There's political power. Who has political power and who doesn't, and what do they yield that political power for? And I think that is just so prescient and so important given the recent election and the elections that are happening all over this country. There's capital. So where does money actually go and to what purposes? And again, that came up in the earlier conversation around a lot of time capital is speculative, right? It's going after profit. And so where does it move in the city to get and find that profit? And then the third is policies and regulations. So what is the landscape of policies and regulations that shape where that capital goes, how that capital can be deployed? And of course, for the last, I guess, millions of years, right, all of that has been situated within a framework of systemic racism that has really influenced both who has power, who has capital, and who has control over these policies and regulations. And all of these factors really influence what our neighborhoods look like, what the housing in our neighborhoods look like, what the small businesses in our neighborhoods look like, what the infrastructure in our neighborhoods look like, right? Are our roads full of potholes, or are they brand new, shiny freeways? Whether or not the schools or community facilities in our neighborhoods have the resources that they need. So this idea of capital and where capital goes and where capital flows is really fundamental to any kind of sort of pattern of inequality that we see in cities today. And have any of you had that experience of like literally crossing over the street and going from a neighborhood that has had the benefit of investment to the neighborhood that has had the benefit of disinvestment or experienced disinvestment? Like you can tell, right? You can just sort of see it in the entire sort of just, I don't know, the physical experience of that neighborhood. What is important to know, and what is central to this idea of community development in the best sense and not in the sense that we were talking about as an extractive process earlier, is that capital flows to projects which have the highest risk-adjusted rate of return. All right, so capital is going to go where it can make the most money for the least amount of risk. And so that dollar store can make a lot of money with very minimal risk because they're not actually investing in anything of value, right? They're selling cheap things for more. And they're selling a lot of it because they know that they can make a lot of profit off of locating in communities where there are no other options, right? If you had a healthy food co-op, you wouldn't go to the dollar store. You would go to that family, that healthy food co-op. And so its approach to where that sort of capital goes for them, right? There is a very strong return from that investment. And that question of where the risk is and where the return is all shaped by these political power policies and regulations, right? So we have this situation where capital is going to flow to the highest risk adjusted rate of return. And what happens is we often see it flowing in ways that are extractive to low income communities and that benefit high income communities. Any questions before I go on? Any comments? So the origins of community development are in this moment of the 1960s, where we see a series of events that really shape how capital flows. On the one hand, we have redlining, which limits access to capital in low-income and minority communities. We have urban renewal, which takes this idea of blight and really uses this idea of blight from people in power to decimate commercial strips that are, vibrant African American or people of color communities. And as that is happening in the inner city, we have the flight of capital to suburbia. And we see this massive investment in suburban housing, right? That is benefiting largely non-Hispanic white households because of racial covenants and other restrictions on who can buy those homes. And so we see a sort of a policy and regulatory environment that sort of limits how much capital is available in low-income and minority communities. We see power, which is used to decimate low-income and minority neighborhoods. And we see capital flow to where there is now a huge return, which is in suburbia, but it only benefits non-Hispanic whites. And not surprisingly, what happens and leaves behind is inner cities that are predominantly Black and brown communities, where small businesses are forced to go out of business, right? Because they don't have both the capital and because a lot of their commercial areas have been devastated by urban renewal. We see increased racial segregation in housing, and we see increased abandonment and vacant and empty lots in these inner city neighborhoods. And it is at this moment, recognizing that capital is unflowing unequally to the harm of these Black and brown communities, that we see the seeds of community development and the community development movement emerge. And it happens in two ways. The first is we see a very strong movement against capitalism coming out of these communities that have been affected. And it's maybe most evoked through the Black Panther Party, right? And this idea that these processes, this power, this capital, these rules and regulations are really hurting their communities. And they are thinking about how do we ameliorate these trends. Within this side of the sort of emergent community development movement, the power analysis is one where capitalism and racism are inextricably linked, right? That you cannot deal with the racism and the repercussions of these policies on Black and brown communities without addressing capitalism. And you see a very strong anti-capitalism movement, but you also see the foundations of really trying to think about what do communities need to be successful. You need free food, you need health clinics, you need community infrastructure, and you need political power, right? At the same time, we see a parallel movement emerge. I'm sorry, it's not working. Which takes a different kind of power analysis. In this set of groups, in this set of organizations, the power analysis is one which says, yes, we see this this movement of capital hurting Black and brown communities, but it isn't that we want to end capitalism. What we want to do is we want to control capital. We want to be the ones that have access to capital to change our communities for the better. And if we have access to capital, we have access to power. And we can really change what is happening in our neighborhoods if we can access capital. And the power analysis there leads them to thinking about how can we change the rules and regulations and policies? How can we build community power to control and get more capital to make needed investments in our community? And this is really what becomes the CDC movement and the contemporary community development field. They each take from each other. They each borrow from each other. They learn a lot from each other. But the modern community development movement is coming out of the idea that what we want to do is grab capital and use it in ways that benefit our community as opposed to extract profit from our neighborhoods. Let me stop there and see if there's any questions or comments. I was about to say, when my students don't ask me any questions, I assume that they're all playing video games on their computer while I'm talking. So I want questions.
To me, again, I'm probably older and been involved longer than most folks on this call. But you're also talking about a repetitive process that adds in gentrification that causes us harm. And when we make progress, then a new vehicle comes into place to again put a barrier up in front of that progress. So, and what comes to mind immediately is, I would ask you, how many Black students do you have in your classes that are engaged in community development, land planning, land use, because we're not getting educated in those things to be able to help steer how the community goes. So that's my comment.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and there's actually you're a stellar student because you've already sort of given away my last slide, so you know where I'm going, right? That gentrification poses a real challenge for the community development field, because what we've done is we've gotten really good at bringing capital in, but this whole idea of gentrification is challenging for us, right? Because that means capital is flowing into these neighborhoods, but to the harm. But the thing that gives me the greatest hope is that the students that I am getting in my classes are students of color, and they are going back and they are coming up with brilliant, innovative, field-changing interventions in these communities. So I have a lot of hope there. But you're right. Right, for a long time, the communities that were affected by these policies weren't the ones that were making these policies. Other questions or comments? I'll be mindful of time here too. So since that period of time, community development has evolved in just, over decades. The key thing that it does, and it encompasses all sorts of different interventions, is that community development seeks to leverage public and private sector capital to meet community needs. And in effect, what it's doing is it's working to lower the risk or increase the returns of investing in low-income neighborhoods. And I think, was it Brian, you were earlier saying that you wanted to sort of, you wanted to figure out how to make things commercially viable. And this is the challenge, right? Like, it's not that the banks won't lend or invest in a community development project, is that project needs to show that it is commercially viable and able to sustain either that equity investment or that loan. And that's very hard to do in low-income neighborhoods. And that's because the returns in low-income neighborhoods are going to be lower because people have lower incomes, right? So you can't charge as high a rent, meaning that housing project isn't going to have the same returns if you want it to be affordable, because those rents are going to be lower. Similarly, if you're investing in a small business, the returns to a small business in a low-income community may not be as high, because the amount of business that they're going to be able to do may not be as much, right? They're not going to have as much returns. And so the key challenge for community development, and Brian, I think you said it really, really well, is how do we figure out how to make projects that we can make commercially viable, so that we can bring that capital into that neighborhood without stepping over the line and making that project then extractive or profit seeking. Questions? The other thing that community development does is really tries to knit together all of the assets in the community to make this work, right? So the big difference between a market rate project and a community development project is that a market rate project can be the idea of one person with some capital and a loan, and they make it happen. In community development, it has to be about partnership with the community, right? To make sure that you're doing something that the community wants, and partnership among all the organizations that are going to be able to make that project work. And of course, and I'm not going to talk about this more because I'm going to talk about the capital piece of it, because I think that might be helpful for all of you in this stage of your work. But power building and policy reform remain critical for all of this, right? Without those two pieces, having the capital is not going to be as helpful, because it's not going to be able to be deployed in a way that helps those neighborhoods or those residents. It looks different in every community. I think Allison did a really nice job of explaining that at the beginning, right? Some of the models can be replicable, but actually the partners in every neighborhood are really going to vary. And it can take some time. It takes time to build trust. It takes time to build relationships. It takes time to raise the capital. And I think that's one of the things that Groundworks is trying to give you space to do, is to sort of work through all those ideas. All right. Let's talk about capital. I'll come back to that last point in a second.
Carolina, if you don't mind, just want to interject really quickly here. A lot of discussion around return on investment. I know a lot of this has to do with like the capital return on investment. But what about that human capital, and how are we able to, as we move forward? I think this is just a challenge for all of us. Articulate this other return on investment that capital investments could be making. They may not get their 20% financial return on investment, but with a limited amount, maybe a 10 to 15%, and you see an increase in human capital, that could ultimately increase their financial return on investment later on down the line. But I think we're very challenged in this field to articulate that and figure out how to do that. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, so that's such a terrific question. Can I hold that question until I start to talk about equity? Because I think that's going to be sort of the third point I'm going to make. And I think that has been the biggest struggle for the community development field. And so you guys aren't alone in trying to sort of sort that picture out. Now, can I just get a hands up? Is this helpful in talking about the forms of capital and how to get it and their limitations? Is that something you want to learn, or do you want to just use the rest of the few minutes I have for my presentation to do Q&A or other things? Helpful? Thumbs up? Good? Yeah? Maybe? All right, I get some thumbs up. That's good. So we work with 3 forms of capital in community development. And there are some CDCs and community development organizations that rely entirely on grant funding, so they just stay in this space. There are others that work with grant, debt, and equity. So 3 kinds of capital: grants, debt, and equity. Grants operate like cash, right? It's just program funds that you get from various places. You can get it from a CRA motivated bank. They make grants. You can get it from a government agency, community development block grants, other types of grant programs. You can get it from a foundation and apply for a grant for a foundation. And you can spend grants as cash. This is the most powerful form of capital for things like human capital development, because you can invest it directly into programs that benefit people, right? You can invest it directly in community organizing. You can invest it directly in education. You can invest it directly in workforce development. You can work everything that you want to sort of invest in people. Grants are really easy and a great way of doing it. The hard part is that it's hard to get grants, and it's hard to get big enough grants to do what you want to do, especially when you're trying to meet lots of need. So they can be time intensive to secure. You often face mission creep, where the funder wants to give you money for one thing, even though that's not actually what you want to do in the neighborhood, right? And there's often limitations on what grant funds can be spent on. But to Dylan's point, a huge share of the community development field is actually focused on youth development through grants and through different program funds that allow community organizations to reach those youth and do programming for those youth. So if you think about a Boys and Girls Club, for example, right? They are doing youth development in terms of providing activities for youth to play, to do after school learning, all sorts of other activities, but they're funded almost entirely from grants, either from the government or from the philanthropic sector. The nice thing about grants is that there's no need for a return. You can spend that on whatever you want, and you can make the case that there's a return, right? That human capital return that Daryl was talking about, but you can spend it and there's not any need for an immediate capital return. Now, what does it take to get grants? If you want to sort of run your community development organization based on grants, right? What you need is you need to be a good storyteller. You need to be able to write effective grant applications and tactically convince funders that what they're investing in does have that long-term financial return or human capital return or those kinds of things. So most CDCs, when they started only working with grant funds and using those grant funds to run programs in the community. And it could be community building, community organizing. It could be, again, sort of education types of investments. It could be workforce development. But the original CDCs relied almost entirely on grants to provide services that the community needed and to build that political organizing base. Now, they benefited from the fact that at the time, the federal government was giving them a lot of grants. And now the grant pool has greatly shifted and gotten smaller and smaller. And so increasingly, CDCs are working with debt capital. Before I get into the debt capital, any questions about grants? Any questions about sort of tactics to getting grants?
Question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any examples of where grants were used to enhance the education of people in the community that really don't understand how all of this works? Something that could be replicated here in Stockton in terms of a kind of an educational model. And I know we're planning on doing some things, but I think that in itself would be helpful to kind of put a circle around what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I can give you one example. So for example, the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. So it's a CDC. It's based in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. they were able to get grant funding because they decided that one of their biggest challenges was that the residents of their building, largely living in affordable housing buildings like single room occupancy buildings and affordable housing tax credit buildings, they didn't have a strong tenant organizing base. The tenants didn't understand what affordable housing was. They didn't understand the processes that were leading to gentrification of the Tenderloin. And so they applied for a grant and they hired a community organizer whose entire job it was to hold meetings to educate people about these processes, about community development, about affordable housing, so that those tenants would have a voice and political power in the city decision-making processes. Right. So I think that's exactly the kind of thing that you would use grant funding for, is to sort of start to build that sort of community organizing policy orientation of your community.
There's also a really good example with the Rural Housing Coalition. Now, it's not community, bringing the community, but it's getting people, it's getting young folks that are graduating from college, their last year, and they may be going into different fields, but they offer them an internship with one of the nonprofit organizations throughout the state. So they take these last year students and they put them through the development of housing and commercial space for that year. And they go away for 1 week and get some really intensive training. But when you take on one of these interns, you commit to them shadowing the CEO, you commit to them working on an actual project, because at the end of the year, they do a mock that you go in front of city council and bring your project that you have been working on during the year. And they pose a question as to what do you need from the city council people? But I'm just saying that this model here, you don't have to reinvent, how would you do this? Because it's now in its 10th year of doing this. We have quite a big alumni. And part of the problem was that why we started to do this was because the CEOs are all aging in place, and there wasn't the next group of leadership coming on board. So 10 years ago, we figured, hey, we better start, getting people trained and introducing them to the world of affordable and development in the community. And so I know Visionary, we take a student every single year, and I think I have hired 50% of the ones that have gone through the program, and it's been recognized. I think now it's been spread into other states coming to the 1 year program. But I think it's something like that, because development, people may think it's easy, but high finance is another ball game.
Yeah, and I think exactly right. And so this is what community development is going to try and do. If you have a new community development organization in a neighborhood or in a city, is trying to identify those kinds of programs that you can tap into and leverage and support and expand, right? Because you don't want to reinvent a wheel, but you do want to sort of knit together those resources that are there and lift up the programs that are really effective and where you can tell a good story. Again, right, to get those program funds, you need to be able to tell a good story and to say, hey, listen, this program, 50% of the people who go through it get hired in a community development organization, is a good story to then leverage more grant funding.
Mm-hmm.
What was the name of it again, Carol?
Pardon me? It's the Rural Housing Coalition. Like all of my students have either come from CSU Stanislaus, Delta, or Pacific, because they got to be from within your region.
So grant funded, and again, right, a lot of CDCs only operate on grants. Look for these kinds of programs, help to connect these types of programs to members in their community. Where what makes a CDC different from a community organization is often that they manage real estate and actually develop affordable housing or develop small businesses or develop commercial properties, that they actually take a role in bringing more than just grant capital to a neighborhood. And the two other important forms of grant capital are debt and equity. Debt is the easiest form of capital to get. So especially right now where interest rates are really, really low, right? Debt is a very good form of capital to deploy for community development projects. The one limitation to leveraging debt for your community development projects is that whatever you spend it on has to have some form of collateral. So you need to have some kind of land or property that you can sort of use to secure that debt. And whatever you're going to do on that piece of land needs to have a steady income stream to support the debt payments, the interest payments every month. And so it works really well for housing programs. It works really well if what you want to do is invest in affordable housing or home ownership programs. It can be used for small businesses. It can be used for childcare facilities, particularly if it's a Head Start facility and there's Head Start payments coming from the state to help support, again, that monthly payment of the debt. Commercial corridor revitalization. The problem is that in low-income communities, right, the risk to the lender is often perceived as being too high. And this is where a strong CDC or CDFI can make a difference, in that organization builds the capacity and reduces the risk to the lender in investing in that project, because the lender knows the CDC and the CDC has the professional capacity to manage that money. And so this is a benefit of having a local CDC, is that you have an entity that can deploy greater sums of capital through this debt financing mechanism for the benefit of the neighborhood. Let me stop and see if there's questions.
I just had a comment on that. I think I agree with everything you're saying, because this is our experience as a CDC in Fresno that's now several years old. I do just want to note, though, that as a CDC that's starting out, we can't access the debt capital because we don't have it's just like any person who wants to go get credit at a bank. You have to have credit to get credit, right? And so as a new organization, you don't have access to debt unless you have collateral. And many banks don't want to lend because you don't have the experience to show that you can do the project. So I've found this to be true at banks. I found this to be true with CDBG funding, with home funding, with Chodo funding, right? Like, oh, we have this available, but you don't have the capacity. Well, how do I get the capacity? Well, you have to do the projects. Well, how do I do the project without the money? Like, so it's kind of this, it's a little bit of a game for a few years to figure out how to do it. And that's where and maybe you're going to get to this point, but we've had to be very creative with private money and telling the story and creating the vision and connecting with people who aren't profit driven to partner with to get the things done in order to build the capacity as an organization to then be able to use debt.
And I think it's a testament to your creativity that that's the approach you're taking, because what has happened in community development is that we've seen a lot of smaller CDCs go out of business for precisely that reason. And we've seen the consolidation of the community development industry into very large regional CDFIs that can then prove that they have that professional expertise and capacity to deploy big sums of money. And so it is very challenging to do it as a CDC as a startup, because you're right? The bank looks at you and says, you don't have a track record. Again, it's risk, right? It's the risk and the return. Your return is low because you want it targeted to low-income families. You don't want to charge market rents. You want to charge affordable rents, or you want to make sure that a new entrepreneur can go into that small business. And so you've got that double challenge of the risk side and not the return side. And so the most successful strategy is finding the right partnerships. And maybe that's a partnership with the private sector, as you're doing. Maybe it's a partnership with the public sector. So if a city government can provide a loan guarantee, right, that is going to reduce the risk to the bank for making that debt or giving you that debt. And that will, again, change that risk return calculus enough that you can get the capital. But it does mean that you need a city partner, or you need a private sector partner. So philanthropic partners or donors can serve that role, where they are providing collateral or equity or a guarantee that reduces the risk and gets it above the threshold where the bank will lend or invest that money. Or what has been happening a lot in a lot of cities is a small CDC will partner with a CDFI, a community development financial institution, and help build those financial skills, and have the CDFI do the first set of projects so that the CDC gets the experience. Because you're right, you're not going to get it if you don't get to do it, right? But it's about that partnership. And that's what community development is about, is finding that right partner for your community. And it's going to look different in Fresno than it is in Stockton, right? And so it's a lot of pounding, or what's sidewalk. I was going to say streetcar pounding, but that's not right. Sidewalk pounding.
But it's also too about building trust. I can tell you that 35 years ago, when I first got into development, I hooked up with another nonprofit. But we also looked at what each other could bring to the table. And we did about 4 projects together so that we could build up, first of all, those financials that all the banks are going to look at. And we also decided, because we were doing apartment complex, who got what at the end of the 15 years. Whether we were in Sacramento or we were in Stockton, if there was a Stockton project that we did, then Visionary took ownership at the end of 15 years. And if it was a Sacramento, then RCAC took the projects in Sacramento. And then we decided, how do we, split the developer fee? Who was going to do construction? Who was going to do property management, overseeing both of those? And we formed that partnership. And after our 4th project, we were able to go both of us in our own direction. But we did have to do that. And based on some of the scoring and what you heard from the group about, CDBG and home, they look for that expertise. If you're willing to walk before you run, because that's part of the problem sometimes, is you want to run right away. And, we all started somewhere. And sometimes you need to remember that you're going to crawl, you're going to walk, and then you'll run.
And I think that's absolutely right. But those partnerships at the beginning are going to be critical in terms of being able to walk successfully. And particularly as the community development field has become more professionalized, right? It is harder and harder to sort of come in without that kind of partner, or without that kind of either governmental or philanthropic support.
Sometimes when the private sector gets involved, you really lose out in the learning process, because they just want something.
Yeah.
Whether it's your nonprofit status, or whether, they just need that for their application. The partnership, there has to be fairness in the partnership.
Yeah. So I've used up all my time. I'm supposed to talk about equity too. I'm going to talk about equity very briefly because it is actually extremely difficult to get equity when you are just starting out. It is the hardest form of capital to get. The one exception might be for those of you who have a philanthropic partner or a corporate partner who's mission driven. If there's a tax credit or other financial incentive program that you can tap into. But it really only works if there is a return or something that will generate a profit in the future. And to Daryl's earlier point, human capital, even though we know that's a good investment for the future, is very rarely going to get a bank excited or any kind of regular capital excited. And so we can try and make that case. The one area where they are trying to do that is through social impact bonds. But those are incredibly complex and they require an actual measurable financial return on the investment of the investments in human capital. And that is very, very hard to prove. But equity can be very, very helpful in bringing the debt on a project down, which will allow you to charge affordable rents or make home ownership feasible. Now, if you can get land donated from a partner, right, that can serve as your equity, and that can be a very valuable strategy for both housing and commercial corridor revitalization. I'm going to stop there. I had more slides, but hopefully this was at least a little bit helpful as a primer on some of these ideas. We're going to break into smaller breakout groups, and I'm going to join each of the breakout rooms